beneath the black sky of Pearl Harbor. The air smelled of salt and oil, thick and humid in the early morning. I remember it clearly, like a photograph etched into my mind. The sky was that particular shade of pale blue you only see before the sun has fully risen, and the world was just beginning to stir. Seagulls screeched lazily overhead, oblivious to what was coming. The battleships of the Pacific Fleet rested in the harbor, their massive hulls shimmering in the soft dawnlight. They looked invincible, mighty sentinels standing guard over the ocean. I was 23 that morning, though it feels like another lifetime now. James Brown, just a kid from Kansas who'd signed up to see the world, only to find himself in paradise, or what we thought was paradise back then. I was a mechanic in the Navy, stationed on the USS West Virginia. She was my home, my fortress, and at times my prison. That morning, I was already on deck, checking over some equipment and mentally going through the day's tasks. Sundays were supposed to be slow, a chance to breathe, maybe write a letter home, or catch some extra sleep. But there was something strange about the air that day. It's hard to explain. The older sailors would have called it a bad omen, but I was young, cocky, and too practical for superstition. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that clung to me like a shadow. And then it happened. At first, it was a low hum in the distance, a sound that barely registered against the usual noises of the harbor. But the hum grew louder, sharper, cutting through the morning like a blade. I looked up and saw them. Dozens of planes, black silhouettes against the brightening sky. They moved in perfect formation, a swarm of locusts descending on a field ripe for the taking. My stomach turned cold. Drills, someone muttered nearby, but the tone of their voice told me they didn't believe it any more than I did. The first explosion tore through the air, a thunderclap that seemed to shake the earth itself. A column of fire and smoke erupted from the USS Arizona, and in that instant, the harbor transformed into hell on earth. The peaceful Sunday morning shattered into chaos. Men were running, shouting, their voices drowned out by the deafening roar of engines and the relentless barrage of bombs. I stood frozen for a heartbeat, my mind struggling to comprehend the scene unfolding before me. Then instinct took over. Training kicked in, though nothing could have prepared us for this. Get below deck, someone yelled, but I couldn't move. My eyes were fixed on the Arizona, flames consuming her like a hungry beast. Sailors leapt into the water to escape the inferno, their uniforms already smoldering. Some didn't surface. The next explosion was closer. Shrapnel rained down like deadly confetti, and the acrid stench of burning oil filled my lungs. I coughed, choking on the air, and finally my legs obeyed. I sprinted toward the hatch, ducking as another bomb detonated nearby. The force knocked me off my feet, and I hit the deck hard, the impact jarring every bone in my body. When I got up, I saw him, Tommy, one of the younger guys in my unit. He was pinned under a piece of twisted metal, his face pale with fear and pain. Blood seeped from a gash on his forehead, pooling on the deck beneath him. "Help me," he screamed, his voice raw and desperate. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the edge of the metal and heaved with everything I had. It didn't budge. Smoke stung my eyes, and my arms trembled under the strain. Tommy's screams grew louder, but so did the sound of another plane diving toward us. The shadow of its wings loomed over the deck, and in that moment, I realized we were out of time. "Tommy, I'm sorry," I whispered, though he couldn't hear me over the chaos. I turned and ran, my heart pounding with a sickening mixture of guilt and adrenaline. The bomb hit the water just off the port side, and the resulting wave sent me sprawling again. My ears rang, and for a moment I thought I might be dead. But the pain in my shoulder told me otherwise. I staggered to my feet, my vision blurred by smoke and tears. The harbor was unrecognizable, a scene from a nightmare. Ships burned, men screamed, and the sky itself seemed to mourn, darkened by thick black clouds of smoke. Somehow I made it below deck, though the air there was just as thick and choking as it was above. The corridors were packed with sailors, their faces pale and grim. We worked frantically to seal off flooding compartments, to keep the West Virginia afloat. She groaned and shuddered with every hit, but she held. For now, the hours that followed felt like an eternity. Time lost all meaning in the chaos. By the time the attack was over, the sun was high in the sky, casting its light over a scene of unimaginable devastation. The once proud fleet lay crippled, its ships broken and burning. The water was slick with oil, and bodies floated alongside the wreckage. I stood on the deck of the West Virginia, my hands shaking and my uniform stained with blood and soot. Around me, survivors stared in stunned silence, their faces etched with horror and grief. And then it hit me, the sheer scale of what had just happened. This wasn't just an attack on a harbor. This was an attack on everything we stood for, on everything we believed in. It was the day the world changed, though none of us fully understood it yet. As I looked out over the destruction, I felt a strange mix of emotions, rage, sorrow, and a fierce determination. We had been caught off guard, yes, but this was not the end. It was only the beginning. And in the back of my mind, one thought kept echoing, louder than all the others. Why? The night that followed felt endless. The fires in the harbor burned long after the planes disappeared into the horizon, leaving behind nothing but destruction and questions. The once proud battleships, the so-called backbone of the Pacific Fleet, now lay shattered, their hulls twisted and scorched. I couldn't sleep. None of us could. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the Arizona exploding in a blinding flash of orange, heard the screams of men being swallowed by fire or water. The officers tried to organize us, tried to give us something to do to keep our minds from unraveling. Salvage operations, they called it. But how do you salvage a nightmare? We pulled bodies from the water, too many to count. Some were our friends, some were strangers. All were sailors who'd woken up that morning just like we had, expecting a quiet Sunday. The oil in the water clung to everything. Our skin, our clothes, our souls, it seemed. The stench was unbearable, a mix of salt, fuel, and death. I tried not to think too much about the faces of the men we were pulling from the harbor, but it was impossible. One of them was the ship's cook, Charlie, who used to sneak us extra rations when we worked late. Another was a gunner's mate I barely knew, but had shared a smoke with just 2 days before. We worked in silence for hours, the weight of what we'd seen pressing down on us. But the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with unspoken questions. Why hadn't we been warned? How could this have happened? And the one that haunted me the most, was there anything we could have done to stop it? I kept thinking about Tommy. I could still hear his voice in my head, screaming for help as I ran. I told myself there had been no choice, that staying would have meant my death too. But the guilt gnawed at me like a starving rat. I'd left him there, trapped and helpless, and I didn't know if I'd ever be able to forgive myself for that. By the time the sun set, the sky above Pearl Harbor was a deep, angry red, as if it were reflecting the blood that had been spilled. The fires still raged, casting flickering shadows across the wreckage. It felt like the end of the world. I found myself sitting alone on the edge of the dock, staring out at the harbor. The water was dark and thick with oil, the surface broken by the jagged remains of what had once been battleships. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was looking at a graveyard. Hell of a day, huh? A voice said behind me. I turned to see Chief Petty Officer Gardner, a grizzled veteran who'd been in the Navy longer than I'd been alive. He looked as exhausted as I felt, his face smudged with soot and his uniform torn in places. Yeah, I muttered, not knowing what else to say. He sat down beside me, lighting a cigarette with hands that trembled just enough to notice. For a while, neither of us said anything. The only sounds were the crackle of distant fires and the occasional groan of a damaged ship shifting in the water. You did what you could, kid, Gardner said finally, as if reading my mind. I didn't respond. I wasn't sure I believed him. You're thinking about the ones you couldn't save, he continued, exhaling a thin stream of smoke. We all are. But beating yourself up over it won't bring them back. I left him, I said quietly, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. Tommy, he was trapped, and I left him. Gardner didn't say anything for a moment. Then he sighed and looked out at the harbor. War's a cruel bastard, he said. It forces you to make choices no man should ever have to make. You think the rest of us didn't leave someone behind today? We all did, and we'll carry that weight for the rest of our lives. But you're still breathing, and that means you've got a job to do. Don't waste it. His words didn't bring me peace, but they stuck with me. Maybe they always will. The days that followed were a blur. There was no time to grieve, no time to process what had happened. The attack had ripped away our sense of security, and now we were scrambling to pick up the pieces. Repair crews worked around the clock, trying to salvage what they could from the wreckage. Messages poured in from Washington, orders and updates that did little to ease the gnawing uncertainty. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said the Japanese were planning another attack, this time on the mainland. Others whispered about spies, suggesting that the enemy had been right here among us, feeding them information. Paranoia hung heavy in the air, and no one knew who to trust. I tried to keep busy, throwing myself into the work with a single-minded determination. But every now and then, I'd catch myself staring at the water, lost in thought. The faces of the dead haunted me, and the sound of the planes still echoed in my ears. One night, I found myself back on the dock, the same spot where Gardner and I had talked. The fires were finally out, but the smell of smoke lingered, a constant reminder of what we'd lost. I looked up at the sky, now clear and studded with stars, and for the first time in days, I allowed myself to cry. I thought about Kansas, about the fields of wheat that stretched as far as the eye could see, and the way the wind would whisper through them. I thought about my mother's voice, calling me in for supper, and the way the sun would set behind the old barn, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. I thought about all the things I'd taken for granted before that day, and I wondered if I'd ever see them again. As I sat there, alone under the vast expanse of stars, I made a silent promise, to Tommy, to Charlie, to all the men who'd lost their lives that day. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing: I would not let their sacrifice be in vain. The weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor were like living in a dream where the edges of reality blurred and nothing made sense anymore. The days melted into each other, a haze of sweat, grime, and unrelenting work. The Navy was scrambling to piece itself back together, to transform tragedy into resilience. For many of us, the shock still hadn't worn off. It was as if the explosions that morning had cracked something deep inside us, and now we were just fragments trying to hold together. I spent most of my time in the guts of the USS West Virginia. She was damaged but not lost, and they were determined to save her. The ship had taken several torpedoes, and it was a miracle she hadn't capsized like the Oklahoma. We worked in shifts, pumping water out of her flooded compartments, welding patches onto her ruptured hull, and clearing out debris. The worst part was finding the bodies. Some of them had been trapped below deck during the attack, and the smell was something I'll never forget. It clung to me, even after I scrubbed myself raw in the showers. One night, I was working alone in one of the lower compartments. The air was stifling, thick with a metallic tang of seawater and the faint, lingering odor of oil. My flashlight flickered as I moved through the dark, the beam catching on twisted metal and shattered equipment. The ship creaked and groaned around me, her wound still fresh. That's when I heard it. A faint, muffled tapping, like someone knocking on a distant door. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound came again, rhythmic and deliberate. For a moment, I thought it might be one of the other guys, but the compartment was supposed to be sealed off. No one else was down there. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the confined space. There was no response, just the steady drip of water and the occasional creak of the ship. I told myself it was nothing, just the ship settling, or maybe a loose pipe rattling in the current. But the sound didn't stop. It was persistent, almost purposeful, and it sent a shiver down my spine. Against my better judgment, I followed the noise. My flashlight illuminated the narrow passage ahead, its beam cutting through the darkness. The tapping grew louder as I moved closer, leading me to a sealed bulkhead. The metal was scarred and dented, a grim testament to the force of the explosions that had torn through the ship. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to turn back, to leave whatever it was alone. But I couldn't. Something about that sound, that steady, insistent rhythm, pulled me forward. I placed my hand on the bulkhead, the cold metal biting into my palm. "Is someone there?" I asked again, my voice trembling. The tapping stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I felt it, a faint vibration beneath my hand, as if something on the other side was pressing against the metal. My blood ran cold. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. I didn't wait to find out what was on the other side. I ran, my boots slamming against the metal floor as I climbed out of the compartment and into the relative safety of the upper decks. When I told the chief about what I'd heard, he gave me a long, hard look before shaking his head. "You're exhausted, Brown. We all are. Get some sleep." But I couldn't sleep. That sound haunted me, echoing in my mind like a broken record. I started to wonder if I was losing it, if the stress and grief were playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew what I'd heard. A few days later, we were clearing out another compartment when we found them. 3 sailors who'd been trapped during the attack. Their bodies were huddled together near an escape hatch, their faces pale and bloated from the water. One of them had a wrench clutched in his hand, the metal rusted and stained with blood. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened as I stared at them, the memory of that faint tapping flashing through my mind. I didn't say anything to the others, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been them, trying to signal for help long after the rest of us had given up hope. It should have been impossible. They'd been dead for weeks, the coroner said, but that didn't explain the sound, the vibration I'd felt through the metal. I told myself it didn't matter, that it was just my mind trying to make sense of something senseless. But a part of me wondered, what if they hadn't been dead when I heard them? What if I'd left them behind, just like I'd left Tommy? The questions ate at me, gnawed at the edges of my sanity. I started seeing their faces in my dreams, their eyes empty and accusing. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, the echo of that tapping still ringing in my ears. But I didn't tell anyone. What would have been the point? They think I was crazy or worse, weak. And maybe I was. But in those dark, sleepless nights, as I lay in my bunk staring at the ceiling, I made another promise. I would never forget them. Not Tommy, not Charlie, not the sailors we pulled from the water, or the ones we'd found trapped below deck. I would carry their memory with me, no matter how heavy it was. Because in the end, that's all we can do. Carry the weight of the past and try to find a way to keep moving forward. Even when the sky is black and the world is burning around us. Even when the ghosts won't let us go.